The hum of the engines filled the cabin of a sleek private jet. Polished leather seats, golden fixtures, and chilled air from hidden vents created an atmosphere of wealth and exclusivity. This was not a crowded commercial flight. This was a space reserved for the powerful, the wealthy, and those who demanded more than just transportation. Manny Pacquiao sat quietly in one of the seats near the center of the cabin. Dressed in a simple polo shirt and dark slacks, he looked nothing like the legendary champion that millions around the world knew. No entourage of flashing cameras, no expensive suit or loud jewelry. Just Manny, his small team, and his calm presence. But while Manny preferred simplicity, the environment around him buzzed with tension. The jet wasn't just any luxury aircraft. It was personally managed by its chief flight attendant, a woman who prided herself on control, order, and status. She was immaculately dressed in a tailored uniform, her hair pulled tightly back, her posture sharp enough to cut. Every step she took echoed authority, and every word she spoke carried an edge of superiority. From the beginning, her attitude toward Manny's team was dismissive. When one of his assistants asked for an extra blanket, she raised her eyebrow, muttered something under her breath, and returned with a half-hearted toss of fabric. When another asked politely for water, she sighed dramatically before handing over the bottle as though it were an inconvenience. Passengers, few as they were, noticed the way she acted. Some exchanged awkward glances, others simply sank deeper into their seats to avoid drawing her attention. The energy inside the cabin grew colder with each interaction. Manny, however, remained composed. He watched her quietly, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes soft but alert. It wasn't the first time he had seen arrogance. It wasn't the first time someone had misjudged him because of his humble appearance. But he said nothing. The first true spark of conflict came when the flight attendant, making her rounds, stopped by Manny's seat. She looked at him with a mixture of impatience and disdain, as if wondering why this ordinary-looking man occupied a jet of such status. Everything. Fine? She asked, her tone more of a challenge than a service question. Yes. Thank you, Manny replied gently, his voice even, his expression unshaken. She lingered a moment longer, her eyes narrowing, before moving on. It was subtle, but everyone around could feel the tension building like a storm cloud waiting to break. And break it would. Because what happened next would not only shock every soul on that aircraft, it would remind them all of a lesson far greater than the flight itself. Have you ever seen someone being treated with arrogance just because of how they look? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The minutes ticked by, and the private jet cut smoothly through the clouds. But inside, the air was thick, not with turbulence but with unspoken judgment. The flight attendant's sharp heels clicked against the polished floor as she paced the aisle, her eyes darting critically at Manny's team. One of his assistants, a young man barely in his 20s, timidly pressed the service button. He smiled politely when she approached. "Excuse me, miss. Could I please have some tea?" he asked softly. The attendant's lips curled into a smirk. "Tea?" she repeated, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This isn't a cafe. This is a jet. Learn the difference." She turned on her heel, leaving the young man red-faced and embarrassed. A few passengers exchanged whispers, shaking their heads. The arrogance was so obvious it was impossible to ignore. Manny, seated just across the aisle, glanced briefly at his assistant. He offered a small nod, a silent message. "It's okay. Stay calm." Soon after, another member of Manny's team requested a small adjustment to the cabin lighting. The attendant exhaled dramatically, muttering, "Unbelievable," under her breath. As she pressed the button, the jet's cabin was turning into a stage, each interaction drawing more tension, more unease. Everyone could feel it, like a balloon being inflated too far, ready to pop. But the breaking point came without warning. When the flight attendant stopped by Manny's seat again, her patience, or perhaps her pride, finally snapped. "You know," she said sharply, her voice cold but carrying across the small cabin, "people usually pay a lot more respect when they fly here. They don't just sit quietly like you." Her words hung in the air like poison. Passengers stiffened. Some looked down, others stared wide-eyed, waiting for a response. Manny slowly raised his gaze, his expression calm but firm. "Respect," he said softly, "goes both ways." That single line seemed to ignite her. Her eyes flashed with indignation, and before anyone could process what was happening, her hand lashed out. Slap! The sound echoed in the cabin. Time seemed to freeze. Gasps erupted from the passengers. Manny's assistant half rose from his seat, his fists clenched while others sat in stunned silence. Manny, however, did not move. His cheek bore the sting, but his eyes held no anger. He sat perfectly still, breathing evenly, looking not at her hand but at her face. Searching, questioning. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Everyone waited. Would the champion explode in fury? Would his team retaliate? Would security intervene? But Manny Pacquiao, the man who had fought in the loudest arenas of the world, chose stillness. His silence was louder than any shout could have been, and in that silence suspense grew unbearable. Because what would follow next? No one on that plane could ever forget. What would you have done if you were in Manny's place? Would you stay calm, or would you fight back? Comment below, and make sure you subscribe because the next part of this story will shock you even more. The sting of the slap still lingered in the air. Passengers sat frozen, their eyes flicking between the flight attendant and the man she had just struck. Manny Pacquiao did not rise. He did not shout. He simply adjusted in his seat, as though he had absorbed more than just the blow. He had absorbed the weight of the entire cabin's fear and confusion. His team, however, struggled to remain composed. One assistant, unable to contain himself, muttered, "Sir, let us handle this. This is too much." His fists were tight, his jaw clenched. Another leaned forward, ready to stand up in Manny's defense. But Manny raised a hand, signaling them to stop. "No," he said calmly. "Sit." The authority in his voice wasn't harsh but firm, like the command of a man who had fought countless battles and learned that rage never won the real war. He then turned his gaze back to the flight attendant. To everyone's astonishment, his expression wasn't filled with anger, it was filled with curiosity. "May I ask you something?" Manny said softly. The attendant blinked, startled by his calm tone. "What?" she snapped. "Why are you so angry?" His words were deliberate, spoken gently, but they carried a weight that cut through the tension. Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "You don't even know me," Manny continued. "But your eyes, they carry anger even before you raised your hand. Why?" The passengers leaned forward, captivated. Here was a man who had every reason to fight back, every reason to call the authorities or demand retribution, but instead, he asked a question. The flight attendant scoffed. "Don't play games with me. You think sitting there quietly makes you better than everyone else? People like you? I've seen enough of them." Manny tilted his head. "People like me? You mean fighters, athletes, or just people who don't look like they belong on a jet like this?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't answer. Manny didn't push her. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his hands folded calmly. "When someone strikes you," he said softly, almost to himself but loud enough for everyone to hear, "the world expects you to strike back, but sometimes asking why is the better fight." The words lingered, heavy and thought-provoking. His assistants exchanged uneasy glances, torn between frustration and admiration. The passengers whispered quietly among themselves. Finally, Manny spoke again. "Tell me, if someone treated you this way, if they disrespected you for no reason at all, what would you do?" The question hung in the air like a mirror, forcing everyone to reflect. The audience wasn't just watching a conflict. They were being drawn into it, asked to place themselves in Manny's seat, to imagine their own reactions. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, her composure beginning to crack. For a brief second, her eyes flickered with something different. Not arrogance, not anger, but something far more human. Pain. Manny noticed. He always noticed. Sometimes, he continued gently, when people hurt others, it's because they are hurting inside. Isn't that true? The cabin was silent, every passenger now fully absorbed, waiting for her to respond. But she didn't. Instead, she turned sharply and walked toward the galley, her back rigid, her steps forceful. Yet even in that retreat, the passengers sensed a shift. Something inside her had been stirred, even if she refused to admit it. Manny exhaled slowly and closed his eyes for a moment, as though offering a silent prayer. His cheek still bore the mark of her hand, but his dignity remained untouched. And in that dignity, the true battle had just begun. If you were sitting there, watching all this unfold, whose side would you be on? Manny's calm or his team's anger? The hum of the engines filled the silence after the confrontation. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Manny remained still, his gaze calm, but his words echoed in the mind of the flight attendant as she disappeared into the galley. For the first time during the flight, her flawless mask cracked. She leaned against the counter, her hand trembling, as she held onto the edge. The sting of guilt burned deeper than the slap she had delivered. Her chest rose and fell unevenly as she struggled to catch her breath. Manny's question haunted her. "Why are you so angry?" And in that quiet moment, far from the eyes of the passengers, her mind drifted back. Years earlier, she was not the poised and perfectly uniformed woman she appeared to be. She had been a young girl growing up in a crowded neighborhood, her family struggling to pay bills, her mother working long hours just to put food on the table. Her father, once the backbone of the household, had left, leaving her mother alone to shoulder the burden. The girl had learned early that the world didn't hand out kindness easily. She remembered standing in long lines for free meals only to hear whispers behind her about the poor family on the block. She remembered being teased in school for wearing secondhand clothes. At 15, she took her first job cleaning tables in a diner. Customers rarely looked her in the eye. They barked orders, complained when she was too slow, and left without so much as a thank you. She worked late into the night, only to return home and watch her mother cry silently over bills that never seemed to shrink. That was the first time she made a vow. No one would ever look down on me again. Over the years, that vow hardened into something else. She climbed her way up, taking courses, working double shifts, eventually landing a coveted role as a flight attendant for luxury jets. To outsiders, she was polished, successful, untouchable. But inside, every slight, every dismissive glance from her past lived like a shadow, whispering that she still wasn't enough. And so she built a wall of arrogance, of superiority. It was easier to belittle others before they could belittle her. Easier to stay in control than to risk being hurt again. But when she saw Manny Pacquiao, dressed simply, sitting quietly with his small team, her old fears resurfaced. To her, he looked like the kind of man she used to serve in diners, the kind who ignored her, who judged her. She didn't see the world champion, the senator, the philanthropist. She only saw a reflection of her own painful memories. Her anger hadn't been at Manny. It had been at herself, at her past, at a world that had never been kind. And when Manny asked her that question, "Why are you so angry?" it pierced through the armor she had spent years building. Back in the galley, her eyes welled with tears she refused to let fall. She wiped her face quickly, fixing her hair, forcing the mask back on. But the passengers had noticed her absence. Manny, still seated calmly, noticed too. When she returned to the cabin, her stride wasn't quite as sharp, her voice not as cutting. Something inside her had shifted. She glanced at Manny, just for a second, and saw no judgment in his eyes, only compassion. And that was the beginning of her unraveling, the moment the crowd would soon learn the truth behind the woman they had only seen as arrogant. The tension in the cabin had begun to cool, but not because anyone had forgotten the slap. It was because Manny Pacquiao had refused to respond in anger. His silence and gentle questions had shifted the energy, leaving passengers curious and unsettled. But Manny himself wasn't finished. He had seen something in the attendant's eyes. Before she walked away, a flicker of pain that didn't match her harsh words. And Manny was a man who had grown up in hardship. He knew the look of someone carrying heavy burdens. So, as the minutes passed, Manny quietly leaned over to a nearby steward, a junior crew member who had been silently watching everything unfold. "Tell me," Manny said softly. "Do you know her story? The one who just served us?" The young steward hesitated, glancing nervously down the aisle toward the flight attendant. But Manny's calm demeanor reassured him. "Sir," he whispered, she's been through a lot. People think she's cold, but..." He lowered his voice further. "She works extra shifts. I've seen her take double duty, sometimes 3 days in a row, always volunteering to cover for someone else. She doesn't talk about it much." Manny nodded slowly. "And her family?" The steward's eyes softened. "Her mother is ill. I think cancer, medical bills. She sends almost everything she earns back home. She hides it, but I've seen her cry alone in the galley." The words sank like stones into the silence. Manny's assistants, who had been whispering angrily moments earlier, grew still. The passengers nearby, who had overheard, exchanged guilty looks. The picture of a cruel, arrogant attendant began to dissolve, replaced by something far more complex. A woman fighting battles no one could see. Manny leaned back, his face thoughtful. "People see only the mask," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "But they don't see the scars behind it." The murmurs in the cabin began to grow. A businessman in the front row whispered to his wife, "Can you imagine working with a sick parent at home?" Another passenger shook his head, clearly ashamed of the way he had laughed when the attendant mocked Manny's assistant earlier. Even Manny's young team members shifted uncomfortably. The one who had wanted to confront her earlier now looked down at his shoes, guilt replacing his anger. Then, almost on cue, the flight attendant reappeared. Her composure was back in place, her uniform crisp, her hair neat. But when she caught sight of Manny's eyes, soft, steady, filled with empathy, something inside her faltered. "Ma'am," Manny said gently as she passed, his voice calm and steady. "You carry a lot. Too much, maybe." She froze, her hands tightening on the tray she carried. The words struck deeper than she wanted to admit. The passengers were watching closely now, sensing a truth about to spill. Manny didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. Instead, he asked softly, "Why? Do you hide your pain behind anger?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to snap back, to deflect, to regain control, but under the weight of so many eyes, her armor cracked. For the first time, she looked less like an untouchable professional and more like a weary daughter, stretched, thin by life. Her voice shook as she muttered, "You don't know what I've been through." "Then tell us," Manny said. His tone wasn't commanding, it was inviting. The cabin fell silent. Even the engines seemed to fade into the background as every passenger leaned in. And finally, unable to hold back any longer, the attendant spoke. Her words came haltingly at first. About her sick mother, the endless hospital visits, the medical bills piling higher than she could climb. About working long hours, always smiling for passengers who never once asked her name. About the bitterness that had grown inside her, the shield she built so no one could see how close she was to breaking. As she spoke, whispers spread among the passengers. Shock, sympathy, and even shame filled their faces. The same people who had judged her now listened with wide eyes, realizing they had misread her completely. When she finished, the silence was heavy with emotion. The same woman who had slapped Manny Pacquiao stood before them now, not as an arrogant attendant, but as a daughter, a survivor, a fighter in her own right. Manny nodded slowly. His expression wasn't one of pity, it was one of deep respect. "Now I understand," he said quietly. And just like that, the truth was out. The woman who had seemed like the villain was revealed as someone carrying invisible battles. The passenger's perspective shifted entirely. The stage was set for what would come next, a transformation no one expected. Have you ever judged someone without knowing their story, only to be surprised later? Share your experience in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe because the way Manny responds next will move your heart. The truth hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and the passengers could feel it pressing down on them. The flight attendant's story, raw, unpolished, deeply human, had stripped away the anger, the arrogance, and revealed something no one could deny: pain. Manny Pacquiao sat quietly for a moment, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes never leaving hers. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was powerful. Everyone waited, knowing he would respond. Not with fists, not with pride, but with something greater. Finally, Manny stood. His small frame didn't tower over the cabin the way a larger man might, but his presence alone filled the space. He stepped toward the attendant, his expression calm but steady, his tone low and thoughtful. "You are strong," he said. "You carry more than most could. But strength doesn't mean carrying it alone." The attendant's lips parted, but no words came. Her face trembled, her pride and vulnerability colliding in a storm she could no longer hide. Manny glanced at his assistant, then back at the crew. "She deserves respect, not ridicule. We judge so quickly, but we don't see the battles others fight every day." He paused, scanning the passengers. How many of us complain when life is heavy? Yet here is a woman who carries her family on her shoulders and still serves others even when her own heart is breaking. The businessman in the front row shifted uncomfortably. A young couple looked down, ashamed of the giggles they had shared earlier at her expense. The entire mood of the jet shifted. Then Manny reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small leather wallet, simple and worn, the kind you'd expect from someone who'd never forgotten where he came from. From it, he withdrew a check. The number he scribbled was far larger than anyone expected, large enough to cover months of hospital bills, perhaps even more. He handed it to the attendant. His voice was steady, almost fatherly. "This is not charity," he said. "This is recognition. Recognition that you've worked harder than most, and still people have only seen your anger. I see your struggle. Let this be a reminder that you are not alone." Her hands shook as she took the check, her eyes wide in disbelief. For the first time during the flight, tears escaped, hot, unrestrained, and real. She covered her face briefly. Her professional mask shattered. The cabin erupted in soft murmurs. Some passengers clapped quietly, others simply nodded with moist eyes. The very people who had once judged her now felt the sting of shame mixed with admiration. But Manny wasn't finished. He turned back to the passengers, his words carrying the weight of experience. "I grew up with nothing," he told them. "I know what it feels like to be looked down on, to be dismissed because of how you look, how much money you don't have. But every person you meet carries a story you cannot see, and sometimes the hardest hearts are only hearts that have been broken too many times." The entire plane fell silent. Even the sound of the engines seemed to fade under the gravity of his words. The flight attendant, still clutching the check, looked at him with fresh eyes. The anger that had once fueled her had dissolved, replaced by gratitude so overwhelming it was hard to speak. "Why? Why would you do this?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Manny smiled gently. "Because once, someone helped me when I didn't deserve it, and that changed my life. Maybe this can change yours." Her knees nearly buckled under the weight of his kindness. She had spent years shielding herself from the cruelty of the world, never expecting compassion to come from the very man she had disrespected. Passengers began to applaud louder now, the sound filling the cabin. Not for the money, not for the grand gesture, but for the spirit behind it. For the justice wrapped in humility, for the inspiration of a man who fought not with fists but with grace. The attendant, unable to hold back anymore, bowed her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered through tears, "for everything. For the way I treated you. I didn't know." Manny placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We never know," he said. "That's why we must choose kindness. In that moment, the transformation was complete, not just for the attendant but for everyone on that flight. The slap that had once shocked the cabin was now only a memory, overshadowed by the deeper lesson of empathy, humility, and second chances. And though they were thousands of feet in the air, it felt as though every soul on board had been grounded, rooted in a truth larger than themselves. The applause inside the cabin eventually faded, but the feeling it left behind was something no one could ignore. It wasn't the kind of applause that followed a performance or a grand speech. It was the sound of respect, of people realizing they had just witnessed something life-changing. The flight attendant, still clutching the check with trembling fingers, wiped her tears and stood straighter. Her uniform was the same, her posture was the same, but something about her aura had shifted. The sharpness that once carried arrogance had softened into humility. She turned toward Manny Pacquiao, her voice quivering. "Sir, I don't deserve this. Not after how I treated you." Manny smiled warmly. "That's where you're wrong. Everyone deserves a chance to rise above their struggles. You don't have to let your pain turn into anger anymore. You're stronger than that." His words landed not only on her heart but on everyone else's as well. For the businessman in the front row who had rolled his eyes at her earlier. For the young couple who had giggled at her harsh tone. For Manny's assistants who had wanted to argue back when she insulted them. Each of them now realized the truth. They had all been guilty of judging too quickly, of choosing annoyance over empathy. The attendant lowered her head, then slowly reached for Manny's hand. Not to shake it as an equal transaction, but to hold it as a gesture of respect. Her voice cracked. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." Manny squeezed her hand gently. "We are all seen. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us." The atmosphere in the cabin was no longer tense. It was tender. Passengers who had avoided eye contact earlier now exchanged nods of understanding, as if silently agreeing to carry this lesson into their own lives. Even the junior crew member who had timidly shared her backstory looked relieved, as though a burden had been lifted from his chest too. Manny's team sat quietly, humbled. They had expected their leader to fight back, to defend himself, maybe even to use his status to demand an apology. Instead, he had chosen compassion, and in doing so, he had turned what could have been an ugly confrontation into a moment of inspiration. The flight attendant excused herself briefly, and when she returned, she was different. She didn't move with the sharp, impatient steps from earlier. Instead, she walked slowly, intentionally, and with a genuine smile. When she served drinks, her thank you was real. When she spoke, her tone was gentle. The mask was gone. She was simply herself. Passengers noticed. Some offered her kind words, others small gestures of appreciation. And though her burdens hadn't disappeared, something had changed. She no longer carried them alone. Manny leaned back in his seat, watching quietly. He didn't need recognition, applause, or praise. For him, the transformation was enough. He knew the slap would be remembered far less than the lesson it had birthed. As the jet continued across the clouds, Manny closed his eyes briefly, whispering a silent prayer. Not for himself, but for the woman who had once seen him as an easy target for her frustration. He prayed she would find healing, that her mother would recover, and that she would never again have to carry such a heavy weight without kindness to support her. By the time the jet landed, the flight attendant approached Manny one last time. She bowed slightly, her voice steady this time. "Sir, I won't forget this. I promise I'll do better. For my passengers, for my family, and for myself." Manny gave her a small nod. "That's all anyone can ask. Do better, and pass on kindness when you have the chance." The passengers filed out of the jet quietly, each one carrying the story with them. They hadn't just witnessed a famous boxer in action. They had witnessed the power of humility and compassion at 30,000 feet. For some, it was a reminder to be kinder in their daily lives. For others, it was a lesson in humility. But for everyone, it was a moment they would carry long after the wheels touched down. And for the flight attendant, it was the day she stopped hiding behind anger, the day she realized that being seen, truly seen, could change everything. How often do we judge people by their actions without knowing the pain behind them? Manny's story reminds us that kindness has the power to transform not just individuals, but entire rooms. If this touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because your story matters too.